Looks like he's taking holiday.
I'm sure he's on the live stream right now.
Right, I'm sure.
Blake's mother got married.
Yeah?
That's right.
Welcome.
Congratulations.
Congrats to Blake's mom. Anybody else got any announcements or praises or anything they want to mention?
Friends are having a baby this week.
Yeah. Thursday, what hospital? We won't all show up at the same time. At Women's, okay. That's awesome. You didn't want to wheel Jolie in here today?
I came from both.
Anybody got any other announcements or things they want to mention to the class? I don't have a whole lot in terms of formal announcements. I know there's a business meeting coming up. Is that Wednesday night?
It's today.
Oh.
Right after the service, so everybody please vote for the budget. We've been working a while on that.
Right after the service, there'll be a business meeting where, if you don't know, Dr. Ashford's been heading up the, I'll say, revitalizing the church budget for 2019, and it's been quite the undertaking, quite the endeavor. He's done a great job, and it's one of those positions that is thankless but comes with a lot of criticism and no pay. So thank you, Dr. Ashford, for all your work with that. Y'all stay and vote for the budget. Anybody got any other official or formal announcements or about the church? Of course, today is December the 30th. If you've got any year-end giving to do, the church would like for you to do that this year. And as you've seen, we're still in a budget shortfall. The church is going through a lot of changes and a lot of challenges. So y'all be in prayer for our church as we kind of shift through getting a new pastor in place, find our way through cultural changes and communities and having the church establish a real presence in this community for years going forward. So y'all be in prayer for our church. Lottie Moon offering still out there. You can't overstate the importance of giving the Lottie Moon offering and supporting the missions that go around the world. So, for people that have committed to go and they go in our place, we're here, we can support them through prayer and giving as they go and give their lives to serve Christ and His ministry. Any other announcements or prayer requests? And we're going to get started. We're going to hear from Sam today. Sam's bringing a lesson on King Solomon. We started talking about servant leadership and going through examples in the Bible of great servant leaders. And so today Sam's going to bring a lesson on King Solomon. I'm really looking forward to it. So let me open us up in prayer and we'll get started. Dear Heavenly Father, God, thank you so much for this day and all you've given us. You are the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. As you say in Revelation, God, you are the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And we're so thankful to have the opportunity to come into your house and to worship you and to worship you alongside brothers and sisters that want to also seek you and learn about you. God, I pray that through this lesson today, God, that Sam is bringing, that you would speak to each of us and that we would learn more about you and the people that served you long ago and how we should live our lives going forward so that we may glorify and honor you. Because we know, God, that that's the reason we're here and that's what this is all about is honoring you and not ourselves. I pray that you be with Sam today as he brings this lesson. Bless him and bless your word, Father God. We love you so much. Amen.
All right. Glad to see that I think Emma finally woke up from her nap, so Haley's joined us. They were sleeping in the car. So today's lesson I want to do on Solomon. If you remember, a few weeks ago, Blake had the idea to go through different notable figures in the Bible and do an in-depth study. And what initially prompted me to do the study on Solomon was I remembered a study I did back as a teenager about Solomon and how he was basically given one request by God and he chose to ask for wisdom as opposed to wealth or longevity or anything like that. And I thought that was really profound. And anyways, as I've kind of dug back in and studied this over the past couple of weeks, it's been really interesting to kind of get a refresher of how different moving parts and where Solomon kind of played into the story. He was born in Jerusalem, and his father was King David. I know we talked about last week. That was the line that Jesus was ultimately descended from. And his mother was Bathsheba. And so you remember the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite, and how David essentially had an affair and then had Uriah placed on the front line of battle and killed. David and Bathsheba bore a son who actually passed away during childbirth. So Solomon was the second born son of that marriage. We'll get to this in a little more detail, but he ultimately ascended to the throne following David, where he ruled for about 40 years. And he was considered one of the wisest and wealthiest rulers in history. He led Israel to the Golden Age, and then, as we'll learn, he also caused the division of Israel. The story of Solomon, in case you want to read it yourself, is really in two main places. 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, and then also the end of 1 Chronicles and the beginning of 2 Chronicles tells a very similar story. Solomon is also credited by some to have written multiple books of the poetical and wisdom books. Dr. Asher and I were talking about this briefly before the sermon began. This is probably a whole lesson in of itself as to which books of the Bible Solomon may have written. Like Proverbs, they believe that David wrote some of the Proverbs. Some people believe that Solomon may have written others. And anyways, there's a whole lesson probably there, as well as the book of Ecclesiastes. The author refers to himself as a son of David, a king of Jerusalem. Also mentions like the wisdom that he attained. And so some people believe that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, whereas others say it was written in third person, so maybe he didn't. But anyway, so that's outside of today's lesson, other than to note that he potentially wrote these books of the Bible, and of course, Song of Solomon. I also thought it was interesting that Jesus also referenced Solomon in his teaching and used them as basically as a comparative reference when talking to the Pharisees. The Pharisees were asking for signs from Jesus, and he, basically said, you know of Solomon's wisdom, but someone wiser than Solomon is with you. And so I thought that was particularly interesting, just because some of the study references I looked at were written from a non-Christian background from some historians, and they even questioned whether Solomon existed, whether this was a myth. And I just kind of found that to be interesting since Jesus references them, and it was like a common knowledge. People at the time knew of Solomon, and there were other texts outside the Bible that also reference Solomon as well. So now this kind of picks up, with that background in mind, this kind of picks up the story of Solomon and his life. When David was old in age, he was essentially on his deathbed, and they knew that the end was near. One of David's sons, Adonijah, I guess how you pronounce that, got together a group of his close friends and basically declared himself king and said, I'm going to ascend to my father's throne. Then Bathsheba and Nathan, the prophet, caught wind of this. And if you remember, Nathan is the prophet who went to David after his affair with Bathsheba and gave the parable of the man who had a flock of lambs and then a flock of sheep, and then the man who had just one lamb, and the rich guy took this poor guy's one lamb away, and David was all upset, and Nathan revealed to David, "No, you are that man." So Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba basically interceded to make Solomon king. There's no reference in the Bible of prior to this story I'm about to tell of David specifically promising that Solomon would be king, but apparently he did. Bathsheba went to David on his deathbed and said, "Hey, remember that you told me that Solomon would be king," and then Nathan came in basically right behind her and said, "Hey, you remember whenever you had this affair and your firstborn child died, and then Solomon was born, you promised that Solomon would be king." And so David declared Solomon king over the self-proclamation of Adonijah. And as a child became, I don't know the exact age. Historians kind of speculate different ages. I heard as young as 12 and as old as 20, but 15 seemed to be a pretty common consensus for his age whenever he took over. And so I would say probably not surprising to have someone so young being seated as the king in a somewhat tumultuous circumstances with your own brothers trying to fight you for that seat. One of the, I would say not the first things, but early on in Solomon's reign, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream and essentially gave Solomon one wish. And Solomon asked for wisdom. And the fact that Solomon asked for wisdom when he could have asked for anything else, riches, honor, longevity, that pleased God. And so God said, "I'm not only going to give you wisdom, but you're also going to become one of the greatest, wealthiest men." And Solomon's wisdom was well known and played out in multiple examples. One is the story I think we probably all heard about, where the two women were fighting over which child was theirs, and not knowing who it was, Solomon said, "Well, let's cut the baby in half and give one half to each of the mothers." And then the child's true mom obviously was like, I don't want to see that happen to my child, so I would rather you give my child away than see him harmed. And so Solomon knew that was the true mother. There's also the story of the Queen of Sheba traveling to see Solomon to verify his own reputation of wisdom. This is another area that could have its own lesson unto itself, just because there's kind of some unknowns about Sheba, and it's an interesting story, but I think the significance is that she was a very powerful, wealthy ruler herself, and Solomon's reputation had traveled to her, and so she made a long journey, actually met with Solomon, stayed at the palace, tested him with multiple questions, and Solomon was able to answer all of them, and essentially, believe like, wow, this man really is who people say he is, and gave him gifts and wealth. So after Solomon asked God for wisdom, God gave him that wisdom. Solomon began growing the kingdom of Israel. If you looked at the Old Testament, Israel is constantly in this cycle of conflicts with surrounding nations, but Solomon had peace on every side all around him. So it was a time of peace in the kingdom, and they could focus on building. Solomon had a treaty with Hiram, the king of Tyre, for cedar and cypress wood, and this wood was shipped in to build the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was ultimately housed. And he spent 7 years building the temple itself, and so. And then I thought it was interesting that after spending 7 years building the temple of cedar, which was this highly sought after wood and plated in gold, Solomon then spent 13 years building his own palace. But I thought it was kind of interesting. And then throughout the kingdom, he built other houses, walls, etc., and actually used the labor of some of the foreign people who are still left in the land to do that. And as the kingdom of Israel prospered, so did Solomon's personal wealth. He was a savvy diplomat and businessman. The Bible says that he would receive 666 talents of gold annually, not including the income derived from the business trade and annual tributes. I looked this up. A talent weighs about 75 pounds. So the current value of a talent of gold would be about $1.4 million. So, and that fluctuates over time in present dollars. But so he was receiving about $1 billion per year. And some people have compiled like net worths, and he was estimated to be a trillionaire, exponentially more wealthy than the Rockefellers or anyone else in history. He also, to expand his trade, Solomon entered into the treaties of the Pharaoh of Egypt by marrying his daughter. As mentioned earlier, he traded with the king of Tyre for the cedar wood, and then also had a fleet of ships that he used for foreign trade. So Solomon, as we can see, was unlike any other guy. He asked for wisdom, God had blessed him, and really all of his endeavors. He had built the temple for the Ark of the Covenant, as David had his father had said that he would do. He amassed wealth unlike anyone else. And after Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and his own house, and all of Solomon's desire which he wanted to do, then the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time. And so the first time when God appeared, he said, I'll give you one wish, and Solomon asked for wisdom. But the second time, God promised Solomon rewards if he followed God's commandments, and also promised consequences if Solomon forsook the Lord's commandments. So could someone read 1 Kings 9 through 49?
But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and will stop and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them.
All right. Yeah, so there, I thought it was interesting that God directly spoke to Solomon and said that if you continue to follow me, you'll be blessed. Your family, your lineage will remain on the throne forever. But if you don't, I'm going to tear apart this kingdom. And so, you had this guy who had want of nothing, had everything he could possibly want from earthly possessions. He was also blessed with divine wisdom, and God spoke to him directly about the consequences from deviating from God's commandments. So, the question is, did Solomon, in all of his wisdom, follow the Lord's commandment? And I think we all know that he did not. And so, if you look to the fall of Solomon and some of the things that went into it, Solomon had over 700 wives and 300 concubines. And I thought it was interesting that this was contrary to instructions that were given to just the children of Israel generally, but also kings specifically. 1 Kings 11:2 says that you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. And then in the Torah, the law of Moses, specifically cautioned kings of taking multiple wives. In Deuteronomy 17:17, Bible says, neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. So, you have multiple accounts in the Bible of basically warning this intermarriage with taking multiple wives, foreign nations who worship foreign gods, because you could, because of the risk that you would backslide and depart those ways. Nevertheless, Solomon took all these wives. And as an aside right here, this probably also is outside the scope of this lesson. There were a few questions here that or points and questions I had here. Is one, the sheer number of wives. I'm curious whether that was, or people speculate whether that was born out of purely like a carnal lust standpoint, or whether some of the marriages were for diplomatic reasons. So, in expanding his power and his reach, it was common to marry other daughters of other kings for building relationship purposes. But so I'm a little curious, what prompted him to do that, and also I think it would be an interesting lesson at some point in the future to look into the Old Testament practice of taking multiple wives, which is at least later on in the Bible, condemned. But I think that's something for another day. But as we can see, God's cautions against marrying these foreign women who worship foreign gods proved to be prophetic. It says that after taking all these wives, his wives turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. That's in 1 Kings 11:3 and 4. So when I first read this, I initially thought, this kind of seemed reminded me of Adam and Eve in the garden. It was, Lord, this woman you gave me, she made me do it, and not want to take responsibility. Maybe it was, I know I shouldn't have surrounded myself with these wives who worship foreign gods, and they're the ones who made me fall. But I think there's probably another part to that, is that Solomon may have been chasing a high that his material possessions could no longer fill. If you look in Ecclesiastes, that we mentioned earlier, that Solomon may have written, it kind of laments the vanities of life. It's vanity, vanity, all is vanity, and it's the author basically said, I have attained great wisdom, great wealth. What is this worth? Like, it's just here today, it's gone tomorrow. It passes on, and so I can't help but also think that Solomon had done, accomplished all these great things, had everything he wanted, but and just continued to chase, wanted to chase some achievement or excitement that he couldn't, that he wasn't feeling, and that also led him to fall away. And then, so as a consequence of Solomon basically turning away from God and worshiping the foreign gods, during Solomon's lifetime, a prophet told Jeroboam, who actually worked under Solomon in his kingdom, that he would rule 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel following Solomon's death. When Solomon passed away after 40 years of reign, his son Rehoboam took over the throne. And when Rehoboam took over, I think some of the people of Israel came to him and said, "Hey, your father ruled us with a fairly heavy hand." It's not entirely clear exactly what obligation Solomon placed, but it does appear pretty clear that there were charged taxes, and some people had labor requirements. And they asked that Rehoboam lighten the load. And Rehoboam went to some of the priests in the inner circle that during Solomon's rule, and they recommended that, hey, you should listen to what the people are saying, lighten the load, and you'll have their heart and they'll follow you forever. But then Rehoboam went to his circle of friends, and they said, don't let up. You should double what your father was doing. So Rehoboam went back to the people and said, you thought my father ruled you hard. I'm going to show you what hard looks like. And the kingdom split at that point, as prophesied, and with Rehoboam, it was over Judah and I believe the tribe of Benjamin, and the Jeroboam over the rest. So, anyways, that is the kind of a summary of the life of Solomon and his rise to power, and then also his in wealth and riches, and then ultimately leading to the division of Israel. So, for me, it's kind of the big takeaways, really two points. One, on the front end, asking for wisdom. That's something that Haley and I have done from time to time, is just pray for God's wisdom, because you can't see the future. You don't know what it has in stores. Things that may seem bad at the time being may work out well in the long run and prepare you for something later on. And so, rather than ask for something specific, like, Lord, please allow this to happen, maybe just ask, Lord, please give us the wisdom to make the right decision, mindful that you know the future and how things will play out. And then to me, the second big takeaway point was on the backside, is to really just never let your guard down or be too consumed in earthly possessions, because it will. It seemed like it was never enough. He attained this great wealth, more than anyone in the kingdom, and was still never satisfied, and lost sight of the Lord, and literally, despite having everything he'd ever want, he still departed from God. And so I think that's something always to remember to protect our hearts and not take comfort in earthly possessions, no matter how much we amass or how much we would like to amass. So that is the summary of Solomon. Do you have any questions about any of this?
I always think it's interesting when you study this. There's major players in the Bible that seem kind of messed up.
Mm-hmm.
There's things we've all said and fallen short of the glory of God. Just
Yeah.
try to think about our leaders today and how nobody's going to be perfect. And how we need to maybe we get out there and relax sometimes. Quickly, there's somebody going to give us for a mistake or
Yeah.
bad stuff or something like that. And you don't know God's plan to get that wisdom.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's good to remember that, Solomon, given divine wisdom, and also God spoke directly to him and said, do not depart from me and follow other gods, or these are the consequences. And despite both of those things that because most other people don't have the benefit of, he still did exactly what God told him not to do. So that's a good point.
And it just goes to show there's no one perfect but Jesus. No,
Right.
I mean, David failed, Solomon failed, Peter failed,
Mhm.
Paul failed. I mean, everybody fails. But, God looks at our heart. And if our heart is full of love for the Lord, we're going to fail, but we're going to turn to the Lord and ask Him for help. And I love how you kind of mentioned some passages in Ecclesiastes, how in chapter 5, verse 7, it says, much dreaming and many words are meaningless, therefore stand in awe of God. And it's kind of like that just kind of sums up what Solomon learned. He should have been in awe of the Lord instead of in awe of possessions and all the things that he had, the wisdom that he was searching for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just a great lesson to just be in awe of the Lord and who he is.
Yeah. That's good. All right. I think that's, Blake, you want to close out?
Well, God, thank you so much for allowing us to gather here today and worship you and just be with us in the sermon today. Thank you for this lesson today on Solomon. And just please help us to take this to heart and just help us to pray for wisdom and give us discernment whenever we're making important decisions and things like that. Just be with us this week in the new year, and just bless this church, this body of believers in the year to come, and bless all of our leaders and give them wisdom and discernment as well. And just be with us